The Caldwell estate stood on a rise above the marshlands, its white columns streaked gray by time and rain. Locals said it had been built not for comfort, but for pride, an act of defiance against the wilderness that had swallowed so many dreams in rural Georgia. From the top balcony, one could see the Ogeechee River twisting through the trees like a serpent, gleaming faintly beneath the morning mist. In the autumn of 1847, the air carried a heavy stillness over Caldwell Hill. The fields were quiet, the enslaved laborers moving with the sluggish rhythm of exhaustion, and the great house loomed above them all, watchful, unblinking, as if it too had grown sentient through years of whispered prayers and muffled cries. Nathaniel Caldwell had inherited the land from his father, a man whose reputation was carved into both local folklore and the backs of those who had served him. But Nathaniel was not his father, at least not at first glance. Where his father was cruel, Nathaniel was calculating. He believed in order, in rules, in keeping appearances. He was a man who smiled at sermons on Sunday and kept a whip hidden behind the pulpit in his study. His wife, Eleanor, was delicate and pale, her beauty the sort that seemed more suited to a portrait than to life. The locals rarely saw her beyond the veranda. Rumors spread that she had fallen ill after childbirth, that her mind had turned fragile. Some whispered that she still wandered the hallways late at night, calling names that no one recognized. But it was the children who drew the town's attention, two identical twins born under a blood moon, the doctor said. Thomas and Samuel. Both fair-haired, both blue-eyed, both eerily quiet. For years people found it difficult to tell them apart, and the twins seemed to like it that way. When one was scolded, the other smiled. When one was punished, the other wept. Together they spoke in riddles, finishing each other's sentences like two halves of a single thought. Mrs. Caldwell had them tutored at home. The tutor, Mr. Whitaker, was a frail man from Savannah with a habit of staring too long at shadows. He lasted only 4 months. When he resigned, he left behind a single note, the ink blurred by sweat and haste: "The boys are not right." No one ever saw him again in Georgia. By the time the twins turned 9, even the servants began avoiding their wing of the house. They said the boys talked to things that weren't there, friends in the walls, as young Samuel once called them. Some nights, laughter echoed through the attic, long after the boys were supposed to be asleep. Once, a maid found tiny footprints in the dust, but not where anyone could walk, on the ceiling above the nursery door. Nathaniel forbade anyone from speaking of it. He was a man of reputation, not superstition. But Eleanor's health worsened with each passing week. Her hands trembled, her eyes hollowed, and she started keeping a crucifix under her pillow, murmuring prayers that didn't belong to any church known in Georgia. The only person she trusted was Clara, the midwife who had delivered the twins. Clara was a free woman who lived by the river, and she visited the house quietly once a month. On one of those visits she told Eleanor something that chilled her to the bone. "I told you, ma'am," Clara whispered, looking toward the nursery door. "You don't name twins after the same man. You don't call on their spirits together. That's how they find each other on the other side." Eleanor asked what she meant, but Clara wouldn't say more. She simply gathered her shawl and left before sundown, muttering a warning to the nurse: "If they start speaking to the mirror, break it." That winter something changed in the house. The temperature inside dropped, though the fireplaces burned night and day. Servants reported hearing children crying in rooms that were empty. Eleanor stopped attending supper altogether. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she'd seen something she couldn't explain. One night, the storm rolled over Caldwell Hill with a vengeance. Lightning tore across the fields and the windows rattled like bones. Nathaniel found Eleanor standing in the twins' room, barefoot, her nightgown soaked through, staring at the wall. The twins were asleep or pretending to be. When Nathaniel asked what she was doing, she whispered, "They showed me where he's buried." The next morning, the ground behind the old oak tree had been disturbed. Nathaniel blamed raccoons. But the overseer, a hard man named Briggs, refused to go near it. "Something's wrong under that tree," he muttered. "It don't smell like soil, it smells like iron." By spring, tragedy struck. Samuel Caldwell, one of the twins, fell gravely ill. The doctor said it was fever. The mother said it was punishment. The father said nothing. He buried Samuel in the family plot beneath the magnolia tree, and from that day forward, Thomas, the surviving twin, spoke to no one. But the nights were never silent again. The servants swore they still heard 2 sets of footsteps echoing in the nursery. The rocking chair creaked though it was empty. And once, during a late inspection, Nathaniel heard his dead son's voice whisper from the attic, calling him by name. "Father." When he tore open the attic door, nothing was there, nothing but dust and a child's toy horse standing perfectly upright on the floorboards. That summer, the Caldwell family sealed the third floor of the mansion. No one was allowed up there. The key was locked away, and the family's name began to vanish from local talk, replaced by uneasy silence. But rumors are like weeds, they never die. Years later, travelers passing through Georgia would point to the hill and say, "That's the Caldwell place. You can still hear the twins playing after dark." And they'd laugh nervously, not knowing the truth. Because by then Thomas Caldwell had grown older, but not alone. He still had his brother. And sometimes, when the wind blew through the marshes at night, you could hear two voices calling from the veranda, in perfect harmony, saying, "Come play with us." The summer after Samuel's death was cruel. Heat shimmered over the fields until the air itself seemed to breathe. The marshes stank of rot and the cries of herons echoed through the swamps like morning bells. The Caldwell house stood in that oppressive haze like a monument to grief, its windows shuttered, its halls dim, its heart hollow. Eleanor Caldwell had retreated almost entirely to her bedroom. She spoke little, ate less, and slept rarely. Sometimes the servants would find her sitting at her dressing table before dawn, staring into the great gilt mirror that hung above it. No one dared disturb her. They said she whispered to her reflection, that sometimes her lips moved but no sound came, as if the words were meant for someone else on the other side of the glass. Nathaniel avoided her now. The plantation still demanded his attention, and business provided an excuse to keep from looking too closely at what his home had become. He told himself the fever had taken one son and left the other, and that was mercy enough. But when he passed the nursery door, he always turned his head away. Thomas, the surviving twin, did not cry for his brother. He did not laugh either. He merely watched. He watched the servants light the candles, watched the horses from the veranda, watched his mother's door each time it opened. Sometimes he hummed softly to himself, a tune that none of the adults recognized, until Clara, the midwife, returned one humid afternoon and froze in the hallway. "That song," she whispered. "That's the same one they sang at the river burials back home." No one asked her what she meant. The mirror. It began with the mirror in Eleanor's room. A tall, oval glass framed in dark mahogany, brought from New Orleans as a wedding gift. No one remembered who hung it or how old it truly was. The servants cleaned it only under daylight, for under candlelight the reflection seemed to move with a life of its own. On the third night after Clara's visit, Eleanor was found kneeling before it, fingers pressed to the surface as though it were water. When the nursemaid pulled her away, Eleanor gasped, "He's not gone. He's here. In the glass." Nathaniel ordered the mirror covered. A white sheet was drawn over it, and for a time the house was quiet again. But Thomas began asking questions. "Why did you hide Sam's window?" His mother could not answer. At night, when she passed the covered mirror, she swore she could hear two boys giggling behind the fabric. The visitors. By late August, the Caldwells began receiving unexpected visitors, neighbors bearing casseroles and condolences. They lingered too long in the parlor, curious eyes sliding toward the closed nursery door. "You've still only the one boy now?" one woman asked delicately. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Yes, one." But Thomas, sitting by the window, lifted his head. "Two," he said simply. "Sam just doesn't like company." That evening, the woman swore she saw two identical faces watching her carriage leave from an upstairs window. One smiled. The other didn't. Nathaniel scolded Thomas for his imagination. The boy said nothing in return. But later that night, Nathaniel found muddy footprints in the hallway, small, bare, and side by side. The whispering. The whispers started soon after. At first, only Eleanor heard them. A faint hissing behind the walls, like the sigh of wind through cracks. Then words, "Mother, listen," and laughter that ended too quickly. The servants began sleeping together in the cellar. One swore that the twins' portraits hanging in the second-floor corridor changed expressions depending on the hour, one smiling by day, the other by night. When the butler tried to remove them, he fell from the ladder and shattered his leg. "They were watching me," he muttered deliriously before dying of infection 3 days later. Nathaniel accused everyone of hysteria. "This house is old," he snapped. "Old houses creak. The boy will be fine." But in the next breath, his gaze flickered to the covered mirror. He could have sworn it trembled, just once, as though something behind it had sighed. The confession. Weeks later, Eleanor summoned Clara in secret. She met her at the riverbank near dusk, where the air buzzed with insects and the water smelled of rust. Clara listened as Eleanor confessed. "When Samuel died," Eleanor said, "Thomas begged to see him one last time. I refused. That night I woke to find both boys in the mirror. Sam's hand pressed against the glass. Thomas was holding it. Clara crossed herself. You let them touch? I didn't let them. It happened. The next morning Sam was gone, and Thomas said Sam promised he'd never leave. Clara's voice dropped to a fearful whisper. Then he won't. Not while that mirror stands in your house. Eleanor clutched her shawl. What do I do? Break it before he learns how to step through. But by the time Eleanor returned home, it was too late. The reflection. That night, Thomas woke screaming. The nurse rushed in to find him pointing at the window. He's outside, the boy cried. He says it's cold in there. But the window was latched. The next morning, when the sheet slipped from the mirror, the glass bore a faint handprint the size of a child's. It was inside the reflection, pressed outward. Nathaniel dismissed it as imagination. Remove that thing, he ordered. But the servants refused to touch it. Finally, Nathaniel himself grasped the frame. It was ice cold. He lifted it from the wall, and for a heartbeat the reflection changed. His own face blurred into two, one beside the other. Both smiled. He dropped the mirror. It didn't break. The river. 3 nights later, Thomas vanished. His bed was neatly made, his toy horse standing on the floor as before. The front door remained bolted. Nathaniel roused the house, scouring every room, shouting until his voice cracked. Then a scream tore from Eleanor's room. She was on her knees before the mirror, the white sheet fallen away. Thomas's reflection stared back at her, smiling serenely. But the real child was nowhere in sight. Where is he? Nathaniel demanded, grabbing her shoulders. Eleanor only pointed at the glass. He went with his brother. In panic, Nathaniel smashed the mirror with the poker from the hearth. Shards rained across the carpet like rain on stone. But as they hit the floor, each fragment showed a different scene. Samuel laughing, Thomas running through a mist, the two of them holding hands by a river that shimmered silver under moonlight. And beneath the sound of breaking glass came another, a faint echo of children's laughter, fading deeper, deeper, as though descending into water. When dawn came, the mirror was gone, every shard vanished. The carpet bore no cut marks, only dampness, as if the storm had somehow poured through the walls. Eleanor collapsed, feverish and pale, whispering the same words over and over. He's not dead. None of them die, not if the glass remembers. By evening, Nathaniel ordered the mirror's frame burned in the yard. The flames hissed strangely blue. But even as it turned to ash, he thought he heard something faint, a voice from inside the fire, childish and playful. Father, come play with us. Autumn crept back over Georgia with a quiet cruelty. The air grew heavy with the scent of pine and rain, and the nights stretched longer than they should have. The Caldwell Plantation, once proud and humming with labor, felt hollow, like a great body still standing after its soul had fled. Nathaniel Caldwell no longer attended church. The neighbors whispered about it in pews and parlors alike. He's cursed, they said. That family's marked. But Nathaniel did not hear them. His world had shrunk to the house on the hill and the silence that filled it. Thomas was gone. Eleanor drifted between fever and madness. The servants began leaving one by one, finding excuses, sick relatives, fear of plague, the weather. By the end of September, only 3 remained: old Josiah the butler, Ruth the maid, and a young stable boy named Caleb. That was when the noises began again. At first faint. A single creak above the ceiling at night, like a footstep too light to belong to any man. Then the sound of a ball rolling across floorboards. Caleb swore he heard children laughing in the rafters above the kitchen. Josiah scolded him, but his hands trembled as he lit the lamps earlier each evening. The attic had been sealed since Samuel's death. Nathaniel himself had nailed it shut. Yet every morning one nail seemed loose, as if something inside was pressing against it from within. Eleanor's decline. Eleanor wandered the halls in her nightgown now, whispering lullabies to no one. Sometimes Nathaniel found her standing at the base of the attic stairs, hand raised toward the nailed door. He's up there, she'd say softly. He's waiting for you. When Nathaniel demanded who she meant, she smiled faintly. Both of them. He dragged her back to her room and locked the door, leaving her to weep behind it. But even through the thick oak, he could hear her singing. That night, Ruth the maid awoke to the sound of humming above her. Not from the roof, but directly overhead from the attic floor. A child's voice, lilting, familiar. Then, 3 slow knocks as if from beneath the boards. Ruth fled before sunrise and never returned. The locked door. Nathaniel could ignore it no longer. One afternoon, he fetched a hammer and lantern and climbed the stairs himself. The air grew colder with each step, and the closer he came to the attic door, the more the light from his lantern flickered. The nails that sealed the door had rusted black, yet one hinge hung bent as though someone had pried it from the inside. He hesitated, listening. Nothing, just the faint, steady rhythm of rain against the roof. Then a whisper. "Father." The lantern almost slipped from his hand. He raised the hammer and struck the boards loose. They fell away easily, too easily. A rush of cold air swept down the stairwell, carrying the faint scent of river water. The attic was dark. He lifted the lantern inside and saw only dust, cobwebs, and the forgotten relics of family life, trunks of children's toys, a rocking horse, an old cradle. But in the far corner something small gleamed, a mirror shard no larger than a hand lying face up on the floor. Nathaniel crouched to examine it. The surface was rippled, faintly misted with moisture, as if it were breathing. And in its reflection, just behind him, stood a child. He turned sharply. Nothing. When he looked back, the shard was dry. The journal. Among the clutter, Nathaniel found a small leather-bound book, Thomas's handwriting, childish and neat. The first entries were innocent. Lessons, games, dreams. But as he turned the pages, the writing changed. The lines slanted, letters overlapping as though written in haste. "Sam says the man in the water listens to us now. He says if I look long enough, I can see through the glass into his side. Mother cries when I tell her. Father won't believe. Sam says soon I'll show him myself." The final page bore no words, only a charcoal drawing, two boys holding hands beneath a tree, a black river winding behind them, and a shape in the water watching from below. Nathaniel slammed the book shut. He had not believed in spirits, not in devils nor ghosts. But the drawing made his pulse stutter. The river behind the boys, it was the same curve, the same bend visible from the Caldwell veranda. And the shape watching them, almost looked human. The attic window. That evening Josiah came running from the yard. "Sir," he gasped, "someone's in the attic window." Nathaniel stormed outside, rain soaking his coat. There, faint and pale against the glass, was a child's face, Thomas. His expression calm, almost kind. The boy raised one hand and pressed it to the pane. Then, beside him, another face appeared. Identical. Both smiled. The storm raged harder, lightning flashing behind them, and in that blinding instant the window was empty. When Nathaniel reached the attic again, the floorboards were dry. The window was unlatched. And from somewhere beyond the house came the faint sound of laughter, carried on the wind from the direction of the river. The dream. That night, Nathaniel dreamt of the magnolia tree where Samuel had been buried. In the dream the earth pulsed like breath. He could hear water beneath it and faint voices whispering his name. When he woke, his pillow was damp, not with sweat but with river silt. Eleanor had disappeared. Josiah found the back door open and footprints, bare, small, leading toward the tree line. They followed by lantern light, calling her name. The trail led down the hill, across the marsh, to the riverbank where the soil had sunk and the current glimmered black. There, half buried in the mud, lay Eleanor's locket, inside 2 locks of blonde hair. Nathaniel fell to his knees. "Take me instead," he whispered to the darkness. "Take me, but let them rest." The river gave no answer, only the sound of rippling water. But as he rose, he saw it, 2 faint shapes beneath the surface, small and pale, drifting hand in hand toward the deeper current. The attic, again. He boarded the windows, sealed the doors, and sent Josiah and Caleb away. Alone, he climbed the stairs once more, driven by something between guilt and despair. The mirror shard still lay on the floor, glinting faintly in the dark. He stared into it. The reflection shimmered. His sons stood there, side by side, smiling. "Father," they said in unison. "Come play with us." Nathaniel whispered, "Where is your mother?" The twins tilted their heads. "She's with us now." The attic air turned freezing. The lantern went out. In the dark, he heard the sound of footsteps circling him, small, wet, quick. Then hands, cold as glass, brushed his sleeve. When Josiah returned at dawn, the attic was empty. Only the hammer remained, rusted and wet. And on the attic wall, scrawled in tiny childlike handwriting, were the words, "The river is home now." The Ogeechee River ran silent that winter, its waters darker than ink. Fishermen said it no longer flowed the same way, that the current moved backward some nights as if drawn toward the Caldwell Plantation. When the wind blew across the marshes, it carried whispers that sounded like children laughing underwater. By then no one had seen Nathaniel Caldwell in weeks. The townsfolk spoke of the house only in hushed tones. Travelers passing through Jenkins County were warned not to stop near Caldwell Hill after sunset. A few said they saw a lantern burning in the attic window, faint and steady, though the estate had been abandoned since October. It was Sheriff Alden Price who first went up the hill after the new year. He found the front gate open and the yard flooded in patches where the river had overflown. The magnolia tree near the family plot had split in half, its roots torn from the earth like fingers trying to crawl free. Inside, the house was cold as a tomb. The smell of damp wood and rust filled the air. Every clock had stopped at 3:12. Every portrait had been turned to face the wall. Price called out, "Mr. Caldwell?" His voice echoed through the empty halls. Upstairs, the faint creak of a rocking chair answered him. When he reached the attic, the boards had been pried loose again. The lantern still burned on the floor, its glass unbroken, the flame steady despite the draft. Beside it lay Nathaniel's journal, open to the last page. "They want me to see. They say the river is ours now. I hear them in my sleep calling me home." That was all. Price left the house without touching a thing. Rumors and relics. Word spread fast in towns like that. Within days, scavengers began creeping up the hill, searching for valuables. Most came back empty-handed, some not at all. One man, Hiram Doolin, boasted in the tavern that he'd taken the Caldwell mirror frame from the ashes behind the house. He said it fetched a fine shine when polished. But a week later, Hiram's wife found him drowned in his own wash basin, his eyes wide open, his mouth full of river mud. After that, no one in Jenkins County touched a thing from the Caldwell estate again. The preacher at St. Matthew's Church claimed he'd seen the twins in a dream. They were walking along the riverbank hand in hand, he told his congregation. And where their feet touched, the ground turned black. He urged everyone to stay away from the water until spring. No one listened, because spring never came. The flood. In March, rain fell for 10 days straight. The river rose until it swallowed fences, barns, and half the Caldwell fields. Cattle were found drifting in the current, their eyes glazed, their bodies twisted as if caught mid-struggle. On the 11th night, lightning struck the old oak by the hill and split it in two. Alden Price returned, leading a small group of men. They trudged through knee-deep water to reach the house. But the closer they came, the less the world felt real. The rain no longer fell straight. It bent sideways, pulled toward the attic windows where faint lights still glowed. Inside, they found children's laughter echoing between the walls. Not one voice but two. "Do you hear that?" whispered one man. "Sounds like they're playing." And then from the parlor came a sound like dripping water. In the center of the room stood a puddle, though the ceiling above was dry. From it rose two small handprints, made of mud, appearing slowly as though pressed from beneath the floorboards. That was when the men fled. By dawn, the river had reached the base of the house. The first floor was submerged, and the sound of laughter carried downstream for miles. Clara's return. Clara, the midwife, had fled to Savannah months earlier. But guilt is a chain heavier than fear. When she heard of the flood, she returned, bringing with her a small black Bible and a vial of oil. She claimed she could speak peace to the spirits that lingered. She climbed the hill alone, barefoot, chanting softly as she walked. The air smelled of sulfur and rain. From a distance, the house looked half-drowned, its roof jutting from the mist like a sinking ship. Yet the attic window burned steady. Inside, she found the place as Price had left it, silent, except for the sound of water trickling down the stairs. The family portraits were still turned to the walls, but one had fallen, revealing Eleanor Caldwell's face. Her eyes, once painted blue, now appeared black as ink, as though someone had repainted them overnight. Clara mounted the stairs and stopped before the attic door. The faint laughter returned, echoing just beyond the boards. "Children," she said softly, "your mother's gone. You must rest now." For a moment, silence. Then a whisper, "We can't. Father promised we'd stay." The attic door shuddered once. A thin stream of water seeped from beneath it. Clara pressed her palm to the wood. It was cold, pulsing, as though something beneath were breathing. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "The river's taken the house." When she fled down the stairs, she heard footsteps following her, small, bare, wet. But when she looked back, nothing was there except water rising across the floorboards. The night of the vanishing. The next morning, the Caldwell estate was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Where the hill had once stood, the river now curved sharply, cutting through the land as though it had swallowed the house whole. Only the magnolia tree remained, half submerged, its branches draped with ribbons of torn cloth that fluttered in the wind like ghostly hands. Locals gathered on the banks, staring in disbelief. One man swore he could see the house beneath the surface, intact, glowing faintly as if lit from within. And sometimes just before dusk, two pale figures appeared near the waterline, holding hands looking toward shore. The moment anyone approached, they vanished into ripples. From that day forward, the townsfolk stopped drawing water from the Ogeechee. They built new wells farther inland, leaving the river to its ghosts. Years later, 20 years passed. The war came and went. The old plantation fields grew wild with vines and thistle. Travelers spoke of strange lights over the river at night, and the faint sound of a woman singing lullabies that made dogs howl in their sleep. A new generation called it the Caldwell Crossing. Children were warned never to play near it after dark. Yet sometimes when the fog rolled thick and the moon hung low, people swore they saw a house reflected in the water, a grand white mansion with lanterns burning in every window. And if you stood long enough, you'd see two boys on the veranda waving. One smiling, the other silent. In 1871, a surveyor's team mapping the river for a railway project stumbled upon something strange: fragments of porcelain, scorched wood, and what appeared to be a mirror frame tangled in reeds. The leader, a man named Henry Lawson, took the frame home as a curiosity. 3 nights later, his wife found him standing knee-deep in the creek behind their house, staring at his reflection. When she called his name, he smiled faintly and said, "They're beautiful boys." Then he stepped forward into the water and never surfaced again. The mirror frame was never recovered. The nights on Caldwell Plantation had grown softer with the coming of spring, but the air still carried the echo of winter's chill, a lingering unease that seemed to settle inside every heart that beat too loudly. Beneath the branches of the old pecan trees, the world felt divided. The grand house above and the quarters below, two halves of a single body that never truly breathed in harmony. Catherine and Eliza Caldwell had always been called mirror daughters. Same auburn hair, same fragile laugh, same eyes that seemed to question everything their father believed to be true. But that spring the mirror began to crack. The secret heart of night. Catherine slipped from her room after midnight. The candle she carried barely flickered against the cold wind. Down the corridor, the portraits of her ancestors seemed to turn their eyes, their oil-painted stares heavy with disapproval. At the bottom of the stairs she paused. The great-grandfather clock ticked once, twice, and fell silent, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She made her way past the kitchen door, through the pantry, and out toward the path that led to the slave quarters. Her shoes sank slightly in the damp earth. The moon hung low, pale as bone. Samuel was waiting by the woodpile, his hands roughened from work, his face half hidden by shadow. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered. Catherine smiled faintly. "Then tell me to go." "You didn't?" In that fragile moment, words ceased to matter. They stood close enough that she could hear the sound of his heartbeat, steady, grounding, alive. 4 weeks now, their meetings had grown more daring, more tender. The housekeeper, Margaret, had warned her that curiosity was a dangerous sin, but curiosity had already turned into something far greater. Samuel read to her that night from a tattered psalter he kept hidden under the floorboards. His voice, low and rhythmic, carried across the fields. "Love suffereth long and is kind." Catherine closed her eyes. "Even when the world forbids it?" He hesitated. "Especially then." Eliza's confession. Eliza discovered the truth before Catherine could confess it. One evening she found a ribbon missing from her sister's dressing table. The blue one, the color Samuel said reminded him of river water after rain. Catherine's journal, hidden beneath the mattress, was half open, revealing a line that froze Eliza where she stood. His touch burned and healed in the same breath. That night, Eliza didn't confront her sister. Instead she followed her. She saw her walk the same path, holding the same candle, vanishing into the same darkness. And she saw Samuel waiting. But what she hadn't expected, what tore her heart open, was the sight of another man standing near the edge of the clearing, Elijah. His voice, low and trembling, carried across the field as he whispered to her own heart what Samuel whispered to Catherine's. By the time Catherine returned, Eliza was already sitting on the edge of her bed. "You've been to him again?" Eliza said softly. Catherine froze. "You followed me?" "I followed my sister," Eliza whispered, "and found my own reflection." For a long time they said nothing. Only the firelight flickered between them, casting shifting shadows that made them seem like two versions of the same woman, one made of longing, the other of fear. The promise beneath the willow. Weeks passed. The nights grew warmer, and the whisper of rebellion swept across the plantation. Rumors of freedom crept in through the talk of travelers, soldiers, and letters from the north. But in the Caldwell house, the greatest rebellion was one of the heart. Catherine and Samuel met under the old willow by the river. Its roots twisted deep into the mud, its branches drooping like the hands of the sorrowful. He had fashioned a ring from a bent brass button. "If I could take you away," he said, "I would." "You already have," she whispered. He slipped the ring onto her finger, the metal cold against her skin. Then he kissed her hand, trembling. Eliza stood hidden a few paces away, unable to look away. She told herself she would stop following them, stop feeling this gnawing ache. But love, once awakened, cannot be unlearned. That same night, when Samuel returned to the quarters, he found Elijah sitting by the fire, whittling a small piece of pine. "You've been seeing her," Elijah said quietly. Samuel didn't deny it. "And you've been seeing the other." A long silence. Then Elijah smiled, though his eyes held sorrow. "Then maybe we both doomed ourselves the same way." The garden sermon. Sunday came. The preacher from Savannah arrived to deliver his sermon on obedience and sin. The Caldwells sat in the front pew. The slaves knelt on the grass outside the church window, listening through the open shutters. Thomas Caldwell stood tall beside his daughters, proud, unyielding. "The Lord set each man in his place," the preacher thundered. "And woe to those who forget that boundary." Catherine's fingers trembled on her lap. Across the yard, Samuel's gaze flicked up for the briefest second. Their eyes met through the sunlight. In that instant, Catherine knew something irrevocable had changed. She would not confess, not deny. Love had made her guilty and holy at once. The hidden wedding. Late in May, Margaret the housekeeper found them, all four of them, gathered in the servants' quarters after midnight. The air was thick with candle smoke and the faint hum of a hymn. Samuel and Elijah stood before the twins, and old Reverend Amos, a freedman who'd once been a preacher in Charleston, opened a tattered Bible. "In the eyes of God, not of man," he said, "what's bound in love cannot be unbound by law." Margaret wept quietly in the doorway as the ceremony began. Catherine and Eliza held hands, their rings fashioned from the same button. When the vows were spoken, a strange peace filled the room, brief and fragile like dawn before storm. Samuel pressed his forehead to Catherine's. "From this night on," he whispered, "we live or die as one." And Elijah whispered the same to Eliza. The shadow of morning. Morning came too quickly. The bell for work rang before the sun had risen fully. Margaret burned the scraps of ribbon and the wilted flowers left from the night's ceremony, fearing discovery. Thomas Caldwell noticed the missing ribbons, the quiet glances, the sudden disobedience among the workers. He began to suspect. He ordered stricter patrols. He forbade the twins from leaving the main house unaccompanied. But it was too late. Because love had already written its name in ink no law could erase. The Pact. Catherine and Eliza met one last time under the willow. Their candle flickered against the rising wind. "If Father finds out," Catherine said, "he'll hang them both." "Then we don't let him," Eliza replied. They clasped hands, the rings cold between their palms. "We run." The words hung between them like thunder. Run, from their home, from their blood, from the world that would rather see them buried than free. The final night. By June's end the plan was set. Horses hidden, food packed, routes memorized. Samuel would lead. Elijah would follow behind with Eliza. They would cross into Savannah by moonlight, then disappear northward under new names. But the night before their escape, a storm broke across Georgia. Lightning split the sky, setting fire to the lower fields. Thomas Caldwell woke to the smell of smoke, and by the time he reached the quarters, he saw 4 figures running through the firelight. Gunshots echoed. Screams cut through the wind. No bodies were found the next day. Only 2 burned rings half buried in ash, near the riverbank. The storm that burned across the Caldwell fields had left more than scorched earth behind. It left silence, that heavy, watchful kind that fills a house after a tragedy too shameful to name. For 3 days the twins did not leave their rooms. Catherine's fever rose and Eliza barely ate. Margaret, the housekeeper, moved between them quietly, tending to one and then the other, her eyes shadowed by something she dared not speak aloud. Thomas Caldwell, meanwhile, sat in his study with the shutters drawn tight. The servants said he didn't sleep. They said he prayed, though the sound that came from behind those doors was not prayer. It was pacing, the soft click of a pistol being cleaned, the faint scrape of paper as he wrote letters to names that would never be mentioned again. The burning fields. By the 4th day the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. The overseers had found pieces of charred fabric near the willow, blue silk, red thread. No one mentioned what else they might have found. When Thomas finally emerged, he called the entire household to the parlor. The twins stood at the foot of the staircase, pale as the lace on their collars. Margaret stood behind them, clutching her apron. Thomas's voice was calm, too calm. "A fire," he said, "has taken from us more than just crops. It has taken discipline. It has taken respect." No one dared speak. He looked directly at his daughters then. "And I will not have this house fall to ruin because of sin." The marriage decree. 2 days later, invitations were sent to Charleston. By week's end, the Caldwell name was buzzing across the county. Both daughters, the twins who had never been apart, were to be wed that summer. Catherine to Captain Edmund Pike, a man of wealth and reputation, recently returned from the coast. Eliza to Reverend Nathaniel Blythe, a widower twice her age with a reputation for moral piety. The announcement appeared in the Augusta Chronicle under the headline, "Caldwell family to host double wedding, restoration of honor at the Ravenscraft Plantation." Catherine fainted when she read it. Eliza tore the newspaper into pieces and threw it into the hearth. "He's selling us," she whispered, "to buy back his pride." Margaret's warning. That night, Margaret came to them in secret. She carried a folded letter, one she had taken from Thomas's desk. The letter was addressed to Sheriff Talbot of Savannah. "If they are found, the men Samuel and Elijah, they are to be taken alive if possible. But if not, make certain the bodies are unrecognizable. I will pay double for discretion." Eliza's hands shook. Catherine turned away, biting her fist to keep from crying out. Margaret whispered, "Your father knows. He's not looking for forgiveness. He's looking for proof." The candle guttered between them, throwing their faces into uneven light, one pale with fear, the other hardened with resolve. Catherine spoke first. "Then we must go before he finds them." Eliza nodded slowly. "If they're still alive." The gathering storm. By the next morning, the plantation was alive with preparation. Carriages came and went. Dressmakers arrived with bolts of silk. The Reverend visited to bless the union before the ceremony. Thomas oversaw everything with the precision of a man building his own monument. To him this was not a celebration, it was an exorcism. He believed his daughters had been touched by sin, led astray by the whisper of temptation. Marriage, he said, would seal them under God's rightful order. The guests admired his composure. Only Margaret knew the truth, that Thomas's hand trembled whenever he wrote their names. He kept the pistol close now, tucked beneath his desk. He believed in punishment. He believed in blood as justice. Catherine's defiance. That night, Catherine stood before her mirror, staring at her reflection. The dressmaker had left a white gown draped over the chair. It shimmered faintly in the candlelight, mocking her. She looked older, her face pale, her eyes dark from sleeplessness. Somewhere in her reflection she thought she saw Samuel's face, the memory of him reading by the firelight, whispering psalms she could still hear in her dreams. She pressed her palm against the mirror. "I won't wear this," she whispered. When Eliza entered, Catherine was cutting the gown apart, slicing through the silk with her embroidery scissors, each stroke shaking with rage. "You'll ruin us both," Eliza hissed. "We're already ruined," Catherine said. "At least let it be by our own hands." The sisters stared at one another, two halves of the same wound, bleeding differently. Eliza took the scissors, her voice breaking. "Then what do we do?" Catherine's eyes lifted to the window, where lightning flickered faintly over the horizon. "We finish what we started." The father's dream. That same night, Thomas dreamed of his own father. In the dream, the old man stood in the burning fields, his face turned toward the sky. "You let the blood mix," the ghost said. "And now your name will rot." Thomas woke drenched in sweat. The storm outside had begun again, thunder rolling over the hills like distant cannon fire. He went to his study, poured himself a glass of brandy, and sat staring at the family Bible. The record of births, deaths, and marriages lay open. He ran his finger down the page, stopping at the space beneath, Catherine Caldwell. He had already written her name in fine ink. All that remained was to fill the rest. Wedded to Captain Edmund Pike, June 21, 1847. He hesitated. His hand trembled. Then, for the first time in his life, Thomas Caldwell prayed not for his family, but for punishment to come swiftly and cleanly. The day of the announcement. June 10 arrived with blazing heat. Guests filled the parlor, their laughter brittle. The air smelled of magnolia, perfume, and false joy. The twins descended the staircase in matching gowns, their smiles painted thin. Thomas stood before the gathering and raised his glass. "My daughters," he began, "are the pride of this family. Today I restore what was lost. Today honor returns to Caldwell land." The applause was polite. Catherine's heart beat like a trapped bird. In the crowd, Margaret watched from the corner, her apron folded tight in her hands. She saw what no one else saw, Catherine's eyes shifting toward the window, toward the tree line beyond. A shadow moved there, quick, deliberate. Margaret's breath caught. It was Samuel. And behind him, Elijah. Both alive. Both waiting. The escape. That night, when the guests had gone and the house fell silent, Catherine and Eliza slipped from their rooms. They wore plain dresses now, their hair tied up, their hands trembling. Margaret met them by the back door, carrying a satchel of bread and water. "Go north," she whispered. "There's a wagon waiting near the orchard road." Catherine took her hand. "If Father finds out." "He already knows," Margaret said. "But he won't catch you. Not tonight." The sisters kissed her cheek and ran into the dark. Behind them, the great house loomed, its windows glowing faintly like the eyes of a watchful beast. They reached the willow. Samuel stepped from the shadows, his arm outstretched. Eliza ran to Elijah, sobbing. For one breathless moment, all four stood together again, the living proof of what love can defy. Then came the sound they dreaded most. A gunshot. Thomas Caldwell's voice, distant but thunderous. "You shame my blood." The second shot shattered the quiet. Catherine fell to her knees, clutching Samuel's hand. Blood stained the hem of her dress. Eliza screamed. Samuel lifted Catherine, shouting for Elijah to run. The storm swallowed them. When morning came, the willow stood alone. No bodies. No horses. Only footprints leading toward the river, and a single bullet lodged in the tree trunk, still warm from the night before. The rain had stopped by dawn, but the sky still trembled with the memory of thunder. The fields lay soaked and blackened, the smell of wet ash clinging to everything, the house, the soil, the soul. For 3 days, no one spoke the names of the twins aloud. The housemaid said the master's eyes had gone hollow. The overseers whispered that he'd seen ghosts walking by the river at night. And though no one dared ask, everyone knew. Something had been set in motion that could not be undone. Thomas Caldwell's household had become a tomb. The silence of the house. In the morning, Margaret entered the study carrying a tray of coffee. Thomas sat behind his desk, the pistol still beside him, its barrel gleaming faintly in the half-light. His Bible was open to the book of Leviticus. He didn't look up. "They're gone." Margaret set down the tray carefully. "Yes, sir." "Gone with them." She said nothing. Thomas finally lifted his gaze. His face was gray, his eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. "I built this house with my own hands, Margaret. Every beam, every nail bought and paid for. And now it shelters sin. Them girls didn't mean." He slammed his hand on the desk. "Don't call them that. Not my daughters. Not after what they've done." The sound echoed through the room, bouncing off the framed portraits of long-dead Caldwells who seemed to look down in silent judgment. Margaret's voice broke. "They were children once, sir. Still are. Children don't know how to burn down their father's fields." He rose and went to the window. Outside the sun was rising, blood-red through the mist. "You'll fetch the men," he said. "We ride tonight. The river trail." That evening the search began. Torches lit the path to the river. Dogs barked, straining against their leashes. The overseer, Mr. Talbot, led the hunt. "If they made it past the bridge," he said, "they'll head toward Savannah. There's abolitionist talk out that way." Thomas rode behind him, silent. His coat flapped open, revealing the pistol still holstered at his belt. They found the first clue near the willow, a scrap of fabric, blue silk, scorched at the edge, tangled in the roots. Thomas dismounted, kneeling in the mud. The sight of that fabric was almost too much to bear. He pressed it to his face, breathing in the faint scent of lavender soap. "She was here," he murmured. "She was right here." The dogs picked up the scent again, leading them along the riverbank. But the trail ended abruptly at a patch of scorched earth, still warm from lightning or fire. The men stood in silence. Then Talbot said what everyone feared: "If they cross the river, they're dead." Thomas turned away, gripping the fabric in his hand. "If they are," he said, "then let the river keep them. I'll not bury what's already damned." The whisper in the quarters. Back at the plantation, the enslaved workers spoke in whispers. Some claimed they'd seen 4 shadows running through the storm. Others swore they'd heard gunfire near the mill. By nightfall, rumors spread that the master had gone mad. Margaret moved through the quarters carrying bread and water. The men avoided her eyes. The women prayed under their breath. In the corner of one cabin, an old woman named Hester rocked back and forth, muttering, "The river took him, but it ain't done yet. The land's still hungry. It'll eat what's left." When Margaret asked what she meant, Hester just laughed, a hollow, rasping sound. "You'll see. Ain't no sin that don't call for fire." The smoke returns. On the third night, Margaret woke to the smell of smoke. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a nightmare repeating itself. But then she saw it, orange light flickering through the shutters. She ran to the window. The quarters were on fire. Flames leapt from roof to roof, devouring wood and straw. The cries of men, women, and children pierced the air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying embers toward the main house. Margaret burst into Thomas's room. "The quarters, sir. They're burning." He sat upright, dazed. "Who lit it?" "I don't know." He stumbled to his feet, grabbing his pistol. "Then we'll find out." The inferno. Outside, chaos reigned. Men formed a line from the well, passing buckets. Women dragged children from the flames. The smell of burning flesh and pitch filled the night. Thomas stood in the center of it, shouting orders no one could hear. His voice was lost to the roar of the fire. For one terrible instant, Margaret saw him silhouetted against the inferno, a dark figure with arms raised as if commanding the blaze itself. Then came a sound that froze her blood. Screaming, from inside the nearest cabin. She ran toward it and saw a figure trapped behind the door. It was Hester, the old woman who'd spoken of hunger. Her eyes were wild, her hands reaching through the smoke. "Help me," she cried. Margaret tried to push the door open, but it was jammed. She screamed for help, but the others were too far. Then she saw something move behind Hester, a shape in the flames, tall and still, watching. Hester's scream turned into laughter. "You see it too, don't you? It come for what's owed." The roof collapsed before Margaret could answer. The cabin disappeared into the blaze. The father's fall. By dawn, the quarters were gone. Half the workers lay dead or missing. The rest stood in shock, their faces blackened with soot. Thomas Caldwell walked among the ashes, his boots sinking into the mud. The pistol hung loosely in his hand. He stopped at what had been Hester's cabin and picked something up from the ground, a ring burned but still shining faintly. It was Catherine's. He stared at it for a long time. Then he dropped to his knees. "God forgive me," he whispered. But the wind only blew harder, scattering ash across the field. The letter. A week later, Margaret found him in the study, slumped over his desk. The pistol lay beside him and used. He was still alive, but barely. His hand clutched a piece of paper, the ink smudged by sweat and tears. It was addressed to Edward Caldwell, his younger brother, living in Charleston. "To my brother I write in ruin. The land has taken what it will. The girls are gone, though I hear their voices when the wind turns east. If by God's mercy you ever return to this place, burn the rest. Burn the house, burn the name, and let the fire finish what I began." He died before morning. The aftermath. Edward Caldwell arrived 2 weeks later. He buried his brother beside the pecan tree and sealed the study. The plantation stood empty by winter. Neighbors spoke of curses. Travelers claimed to see candlelight flickering in the windows at night, long after the house was abandoned. And every year, on the night of the fire, the river glowed faintly red, as if reflecting flames that no longer burned. The survivor. Years later, in 1865, a woman appeared in Savannah, pale, frail, with auburn hair streaked with gray. She called herself Mrs. Catherine Weller. She rented a small room above a tailor's shop and never spoke of her past. But once a week she walked to the river and left flowers at the water's edge. The locals said she whispered names into the current, 2 men's, 1 woman's, before turning away with tears in her eyes. Some swore she wore a ring that looked melted, as if forged from something that had survived a great fire. When Thomas Caldwell died in the spring of 1853, the air around the plantation seemed to breathe easier. The fields stood quiet that week, no overseer's whistle, no sermons of obedience echoing from the veranda. The man who once commanded the soil like a god had finally fallen silent. Yet his presence lingered, heavy and judging, in every creaking floorboard and oil portrait that still watched over the halls. Edward Caldwell, his younger brother, returned from Savannah to settle the estate. He arrived alone, dressed in black, with a lawyer's briefcase and a disposition sharpened by years of distance. Unlike Thomas, Edward had never taken to the plantation life. He found the air of wealth suffocating, the smiles too thin to trust. For 3 days, he wandered through the manor as if reacquainting himself with the ghosts he'd left behind. The servants kept their heads down, whispering that strange noises came from the old study after sunset. No one dared go near it, not since the night Thomas died. On the 4th evening, Edward unlocked the study for the first time. The air was stale, layered with the musk of cigar smoke and old ink. Books leaned tiredly in their cases, the dust thick enough to dull the titles. On the desk, a single brass lamp sat unlit beside an unfinished letter. The letter was addressed to Reverend Cole in Charleston. The ink had dried mid-sentence. "I have begun to suspect that the sins of my daughters." The line broke there, as if the old man's heart had failed before his confession could find shape. Edward frowned, folding the letter back into the envelope. It was dated the very night of March 18, 1847, the same night the twins had vanished, and the same night the fire consumed half the slave quarters. He exhaled slowly. So the rumors were true. For years, the Caldwell family had denied the whispers, that Thomas's twin daughters had run away with two enslaved men, that they had been seen heading toward the riverbanks before dawn. But no proof ever surfaced, no bodies were found, and the official record declared them lost. Edward poured himself a drink and walked toward the fireplace. That's when he noticed it, a loose panel of wood behind the mantel. He pulled gently. It came free with a soft groan, revealing a small compartment tucked behind the bricks. Inside was a wooden box, darkened by age, its brass latch worn smooth. The initials TC were carved into its lid. For a long while he simply stared. Then he carried it to the desk, lit the lamp, and opened it. Inside lay a stack of letters, bound by faded ribbon. Beneath them, two small folded pieces of parchment, marriage certificates. The first read, "Catherine Caldwell and Samuel Whitlock, joined in holy matrimony, March 17, 1847. The second, "Eliza Caldwell and Elijah Price, joined in holy matrimony, March 17, 1847. Edward's hand trembled. His eyes darted between the documents and the names. Both unions bore the signature of Reverend Cole. The same Reverend to whom Thomas's unfinished letter was addressed. He leafed through the stack of letters next. Each one bore Catherine's delicate handwriting, words heavy with fear and passion. "Father will never understand. He believes love belongs to skin and status, not to the soul. But Samuel speaks to me as if my heart were equal to his." Another read, "We plan to leave after the wedding when the moon hides behind the clouds. Eliza says Elijah knows the river paths better than any man. We'll take nothing but our vows." Edward sat back, the glass of brandy untouched beside him. The truth was here, the story buried for 6 years beneath his brother's pride and the county's silence. He took one more letter from the pile, the final entry, its paper crinkled and stained with what looked like rain. "If this reaches anyone after we've gone, tell them we went willingly. Tell them the world we left behind was never ours to begin with." He closed his eyes. A faint chill swept through the room. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant fields. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat in the study until dawn, reading every letter again and again. By morning he made a decision. He would not hand the box to the lawyer. He would not turn it over to the church or the county archive. He wrapped the box in cloth and sealed it beneath the floorboards, beneath the very chair Thomas Caldwell had used to dictate his last orders. As the hammer struck, Edward whispered under his breath, "Let your sins stay buried, brother. But their love will not die with them." Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out into the pale morning light. The manor's windows watched him go, reflecting his silhouette across the wet grass. By afternoon, the servants noticed the study door had been locked again. The key was nowhere to be found. For the next century, the box remained hidden, its letters undisturbed, its truth waiting patiently beneath the dust. But in time wood rots and walls whisper. And when the floorboards of that study were finally lifted in 1964, the box breathed again, its ribbons still faintly scented of smoke and rosewater. Inside, the world rediscovered what Thomas Caldwell tried so hard to erase. 2 women who loved against the laws of their time. 2 men who defied the cruelty of ownership. And a family whose name would never again be spoken with pride. The war had ended, but Georgia had not yet healed. The smoke of burned plantations still lingered like ghosts above the trees, and every road leading south seemed lined with the bones of a dying world. It was August of 1865 when a woman calling herself Clara Whitlock arrived at the remains of the Caldwell plantation. The house was half collapsed, ivy choking its brick skin, windows boarded with war-scarred timber. To most, it looked abandoned, one of the hundreds of old estates gutted by time and defeat. But to her, it was home. She stood at the rusted gate for a long while, gloved hands trembling as she traced the initials still carved into the stone. TC 1832. Her father's mark. The one she had sworn never to see again. But Catherine Caldwell had returned, older now, her beauty thinned by years of hiding, her accent softened by distance. The woman the world believed dead had come home wearing another name. The war had erased many things: borders, fortunes, even family histories. But for Catherine it had also erased fear. With Samuel gone, lost to yellow fever in 1863, she had nothing left but the promise she'd made to her sister, Eliza. Find the truth. Tell our story. The front doors were locked, but the side entrance yielded easily. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and silence. Dust floated in long silver beams through cracked shutters. The grand staircase stood like a spine of bone, its railing split and warped by years of neglect. She moved slowly, every creak beneath her boots echoing like a memory. In the dining room, she saw the ghost of a table where her father had once lectured them about honor. In the parlor, she saw the faded spot on the floor where Eliza had dropped her music sheets that last night before they fled. Catherine pressed her palm to the wall. "I came back," she whispered. Upstairs, the study door was still locked. The same heavy brass knob, the same scent of cold smoke lingering faintly beyond it. But Catherine had come prepared. From her pocket, she drew a small iron key, the one Samuel had kept all those years, hidden in a leather pouch along with their marriage certificate. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with a slow click and the door swung open. Inside, the room looked frozen in time. The desk still stood in the same place, the chair still pushed back slightly, as if Thomas Caldwell had just risen from it. The books were swollen with age, their spines curled from damp. She stepped closer, her eyes settling on the floorboards beneath the window, warped slightly, uneven. She knelt. Her fingers brushed a faint line where the wood had been pried up before. Her heart raced. With the handle of a rusted letter opener, she levered the plank loose. Beneath it lay the box, small, dust-caked, wrapped in decayed cloth. Catherine's breath caught. She lifted it slowly and set it on the desk. The hinges creaked as if the past itself were exhaling. Inside, the letters waited, tied by that same ribbon Edward had placed there 12 years before. The ink was brown, the paper brittle, but her own handwriting was unmistakable. She read one line and wept. "If this reaches anyone after we've gone, tell them we went willingly." The tears came not from sadness but from vindication. Every lie her father told, every rumor the county spread, all of it was here, preserved like an artifact of truth. For hours she sat in that decaying study reading each word she had written in her youth. Samuel's name. Eliza's laughter. The nights they planned their escape, believing the river and the stars would protect them. But then she found something she didn't recognize. At the bottom of the box, a folded parchment written not by her but by Edward Caldwell. The letter was dated 1853, the year of her father's death. "To whichever of you may return, know that I found your letters, your vows, and the truth your father could not bear to face. I could not destroy them. I buried them instead in hope that one day love might outlive shame." Catherine pressed the paper to her chest. "Thank you, Edward," she whispered. She stayed there until the light began to fade. When the last orange rays bled through the cracks in the shutters, she gathered the letters and placed them into a satchel. She would not leave them here again. As she turned to go, something shifted in the far corner, a soft creak, almost like a footstep. She froze. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the rustle of the drapes. Her pulse quickened. She slowly approached the corner. The floorboards near the fireplace were stained black, old smoke marks, perhaps from the night of the fire. But there was something else carved faintly into the wood beneath the soot. 2 intertwined initials, C and S. Her fingers trembled as she traced them. In that moment she felt Samuel beside her, the warmth of his voice, the quiet certainty that love had not died even in exile. "Together," she whispered, repeating their vow. "Always." Then she struck a match and lit the lamp. For the first time in 18 years, light filled the study again. The flicker revealed portraits still hanging crooked along the wall, her father's cold stare watching her from the largest frame. She looked up at it and smiled faintly. "You couldn't bury us forever." She reached for the frame, pulled it from the wall and turned it over. There, behind the canvas, was another folded sheet, hidden between the layers of paint and wood. It was Thomas Caldwell's final confession. "If God grants me forgiveness, let it not be for what I did to others, but for what I failed to see in my own children. I feared sin where there was only love." Catherine closed her eyes, tears cutting through the dust on her cheeks. Even in death, her father's guilt had been buried beneath pride and fear. When she left the study that night, she did not lock it behind her. She let the wind sweep through, scattering the papers, allowing the house itself to breathe again. Outside, the sky had turned violet, the crickets singing among the ruins. Catherine walked down the old gravel path, the satchel of letters pressed to her heart. She did not look back. The Caldwell house, once a monument of arrogance, now stood as a tomb of truth. In the distance, a storm gathered over the horizon, thunder rolling across the same fields that had once known the footsteps of four lovers who refused to bow to their world's cruelty. And as lightning illuminated the ruins, it seemed for an instant that two figures stood by the porch, one in a white dress, the other in a tattered coat, watching her go, smiling faintly in the glow. By dawn the house was quiet again. But the story of Catherine Caldwell, now Clara Whitlock, had finally found its ending.